fiasco without end. Devastating report from Whitehall watchdog finds the Home Office doesn't actually know how many bloody asylum seekers have...
Birmingham erupted into chaos as frustration boiled over into the streets. What began as a rally to express opposition to the new digital ID system quickly escalated into widespread unrest, paralyzing parts of the city and disrupting daily life. The protest was not random. It reflected deep-seated dissatisfaction with government policies that many citizens perceive as unfairly prioritizing newcomers over long-standing residents. Social trust eroded as people witnessed institutions fail to protect neighborhoods, and live coverage of the events was restricted, leaving communities feeling abandoned and unheard. This was a demonstration of the growing disconnect between policy and the lived experiences of citizens, illustrating the dangers of a government that prioritizes optics and data over human realities. The unrest became a message, a wake-up call, and a stark reminder of the power of public perception when institutional transparency collapses. The spark of urban unrest. The trigger for the unrest was a protest against the mandatory digital ID framework, which many citizens viewed as a tool of control rather than safety. The demonstration quickly transformed into direct action, with people taking to city streets to express anger and frustration. Ordinary citizens felt the law was no longer working for them, that compliance came at the expense of personal freedom, and that authorities had lost touch with public sentiment. Initial acts of property damage, including smashed windows and blocked trams, were emblematic of a population expressing its grievances when conventional channels were perceived as ineffective. The mood shifted from peaceful dissent to a collective assertion of agency, where people felt compelled to take matters into their own hands, to reclaim control over their environment, and challenge a system seen as both invasive and dismissive. Government paralysis and the blackout authorities struggled to respond effectively as events escalated. Traditional policing and media coverage were hampered by deliberate blackout measures, cutting live feeds, and limiting information to the public. The blackout intensified public anxiety, as citizens could not see what was happening in their own neighborhoods. Instead of proactive protection, the state chose containment and narrative control, prioritizing appearances over safety. This tactic revealed the limits of centralized authority in managing complex urban unrest. The decision to restrict information fueled distrust and allowed rumors to spread, amplifying anger and fear. Citizens began to perceive the government not as a protector, but as an entity more concerned with hiding facts than addressing real threats, creating a sense of abandonment that transformed ordinary unrest into a deeper crisis of governance and legitimacy. The digital ID as a catalyst. The new digital ID system became the focal point for public anger, symbolizing broader concerns about surveillance, control, and inequality. Many citizens felt forced into a framework that monitored their movements, finances, and communications while failing to address crime effectively. This perceived imbalance generated resentment, particularly as authorities prioritized digital compliance over physical safety. The framework, intended to ensure security and transparency, was seen as a tool of oppression, making lawful citizens feel monitored and punished while offenders operated with impunity. The system's rollout exacerbated pre-existing tensions, serving as a catalyst for mass action. Protesters interpreted the policy not just as administrative overreach, but as a direct threat to personal autonomy and community trust, transforming a policy change into a flashpoint for civil unrest and widespread civic frustration. Public perception and mistrust. A key driver of the unrest was the erosion of trust between citizens and institutions. Policies that masked the identity and status of offenders fueled suspicion and resentment. Citizens felt the system applied transparency selectively, punishing law-abiding individuals while shielding certain populations. Social media and eyewitness accounts clashed with official narratives, leaving communities feeling deceived and marginalized. The blackout of live reporting only deepened the perception of concealment, creating a gap between lived reality and governmental messaging. In this environment, ordinary grievances escalated into mass action. People no longer relied on official channels to understand events, instead turning to informal networks, amplifying collective outrage. The unrest was thus as much a reaction to perceived injustice and opacity as it was to policy itself, reflecting a societal desire for accountability, truth, and recognition from governing institutions. Escalation and targeted action. The protests evolved into targeted actions against sites associated with undocumented arrivals and digital ID enforcement. Participants moved deliberately, focusing on locations representing policies they opposed. This strategic approach showed that the unrest was driven by specific grievances rather than blind rage. Citizens sought to highlight what they saw as contradictions in enforcement, strict surveillance on compliant individuals versus protection and anonymity for those bypassing legal frameworks. The crowd's actions were informed, coordinated, and symbolic, illustrating frustration with a system that appeared to reward some while punishing others. The unrest became a lens through which citizens expressed opposition to perceived inequities, and their choice of targets reflected an intent to confront the institutions that they felt had betrayed their communities. The role of media and information suppression media coverage was heavily controlled, with authorities limiting the public's view of unfolding events. Live feeds were cut, social media accounts were suspended, and government statements framed the unrest as isolated or chaotic, obscuring underlying motivations. This information suppression amplified public anger, as citizens felt deliberately excluded from the truth. In this environment, rumor and speculation flourished, reinforcing the perception that the state prioritized optics over safety. The blackout also revealed the fragility of trust in information networks, showing how control over media can escalate unrest rather than contain it. Citizens recognized the manipulation and responded not only to local events, but to the broader context of state control over knowledge and communication. Police constraints and operational challenges. Law enforcement faced unprecedented limitations under strict non-disclosure protocols. Officers were instructed to withhold details about the identity and status of offenders, creating operational blind spots. This restriction left police unable to fully communicate risks to the public or justify their decisions, undermining their authority and effectiveness. Officers reported frustration and fear of disciplinary action, further complicating response efforts. The inability to speak openly eroded morale and contributed to the perception that the state was prioritizing narrative control over citizen safety. This combination of constraints and fear transformed policing from an active, responsive function into a reactive, constrained performance, leaving communities vulnerable and escalating the sense of disorder. Economic friction and social inequality. Underlying the unrest was growing resentment over perceived economic inequities. Citizens viewed welfare and support measures for new arrivals as funded by the labor of long-standing residents. This perceived imbalance created social friction, especially in communities facing rising costs and stagnating opportunities. Citizens felt unfairly burdened while resources were allocated in ways that appeared politically motivated rather than need-based. The digital ID system became a symbol of this economic grievance, representing both control and inequity. The protests reflected a broader sense of frustration at policies seen as privileging certain populations over others, exacerbating social divisions and reinforcing the perception that governance favored optics, electoral strategy, or ideological objectives over the lived experiences of ordinary citizens. Conclusion: governance, trust, and the digital divide. The events in Birmingham exposed a convergence of policy, technology, and societal discontent. Mandatory digital ID systems, selective transparency, and perceived inequities created a powder keg of distrust and frustration. The government's focus on narrative management, data compliance, and optics over citizens' safety amplified unrest, demonstrating the dangers of prioritizing control over connection. Citizens' coordinated response highlighted the power of agency, the importance of transparency, and the limits of centralized authority. This episode serves as a cautionary tale for governance in the digital age. Control without legitimacy breeds resistance, suppression without engagement erodes trust, and when the public perceives inequity, order is fragile. Urban unrest was not merely a failure of law enforcement, but a reflection of deeper societal fractures demanding attention, empathy, and accountable leadership.